Welcome back to the Farm Show here on Westplex Talk 1045. On our last episode in C Block, that's the third block of the show, where we usually discuss profits, maybe a little bit of corporate agriculture. Well, in our last episode, we talked about Bayer and Corteva, two behemoths in the global and U.S. ag markets. Well, like the great St. Louis and Yogi Berra said, it's deja vu all over again. Let's start with Bayer. Last Friday on the Brad and John Show, which you can hear right here on Westplex Talk 1045 every weekday morning, Monday through Friday from 7 to 8 a.m., we discussed the hottest news about Bayer. Take a listen. A headline via Jack Suntrup in the Post-Dispatch and other outlets that you'll find on johncombest.com today. A headline, Bayer considers an end to Roundup after Missouri High Court affirms $600 million verdict. The Missouri Supreme Court says, no, we're not going to reconsider a $600 million verdict against the company. Now, I'm struck by the first part of this. Bayer considers an end to Roundup. Have you heard anyone mention that before, Brad?
John, you and I have talked about this, and the thing that I always bring up, I don't understand how these suits are ongoing, but yet I can get off the air here at 8 o'clock and go to a Home Depot or a Walmart or a Lowe's and buy Roundup and fill my truck with it if I want. You know what I'm saying?
You can still buy glyphosate over the counter. You're exactly right, Brad. And there are just so many cases. I don't know how anyone keeps track. I'll read a quote, point of personal privilege here. Its options could include stopping production of glyphosate, the active ingredient found in the Roundup weed killer. Brian Leak, spokesperson for Bayer, said in a statement Thursday that the current situation was untenable. And here's the quote from Mr. Leak. There is a limit to what we can do, which is why we support legislation at both a federal and state level. And I said point of personal privilege because in the interest of conflict of interest, I love Brian Leak. I used to work with Brian Leak. Brad, I made fun of you yesterday in C Block. We had a good laugh at your expense for knowing show tunes, which I think clinically is known somewhere between gay and super gay. So let me make up for it by pointing out that I love Brian Leak. Anyway, Brian acknowledges reality here, which is that, man, this current trend is simply unsustainable. And when I brought up the See, I Told You So, you and I, in May of 2024, discussed Roundup, and I said, don't be surprised to open up a proverbial newspaper or a website in 2025 or 2026 and see that Bayer has sold off its flagship herbicide assets. Brad, it seems like we're inching closer. And if you're involved in the Missouri political world, you say, John, it's some farming stuff. Who cares? You'll recall a whole lot of controversy the last two legislative sessions about glyphosate legislation. Maybe there's no need for glyphosate legislation now that Bayer's going to wave the white flag.
Well, John, who would buy it if they spun it off? Who would touch that?
I maintain that there's a company called Syngenta that's owned by the Chinese. Brad, I don't think if you're a farmer who has a non-Hodgkin's lymphoma and you decide you want to blame it on Monsanto and you take that case to the court of China, I don't think you're going to get a really fair case over in China. You know what I'm saying?
Yeah, I guess. In other words, you're saying that they could do it because they just said, hey, come and sue it in our courts. and
Yeah, I'm sorry to interrupt you with laughter, but good luck if you're a trial attorney
right,
and you say somebody has some disease because they walked past a playground where Roundup was sprayed in 2004. I don't think a Chinese court is going to be really sympathetic to that argument.
Well, you know, you and I have talked about this before as well, too. That's why all these people who make products in the United States complain about the fact that, you know, they got patents and things like that. They get knocked off by the Chinese. And essentially, what do? You can't sue them. You know what I mean?
You can't sue them, Brad. Okay, that clip, once again, was from the Brad and John Show, which you can hear from 7 to 8 a.m. right here on Westplex Talk 1045. And I'm not one to beat a dead horse, but I gotta say, I still think Bayer is going to throw in the towel, wave the white flag when it comes to glyphosate sales and Roundup. I think the litigation cost is just too much for the German company to bear. Going from a German company to a United States-based company. In the last episode, we discussed how Corteva would be splitting into two. One company would focus on crop protection solutions. That would keep the name Corteva. And a new company, generically known as Spinco, that's a pretty common term for a spinoff company. The new company, which we'll call Spinco, would be focused on seeds, traits, genetics. And last week we discussed how this new Spinco would be beginning to dabble in some areas like cotton, wheat, rice, maybe even fruits and vegetables. In the last episode, we heard from the prepared remarks from Corteva's CEO, Chuck Magro. And on these calls, the prepared portion of the call can be pretty interesting because the executive lays out the vision. But the really good parts tend to come when investor analysts, when folks on Wall Street, and when people who represent these investment companies start to dig in with the tough questions. So let's go to some of those investor analyst questions for the executives. And the first question came from Chris Wolf. He's the managing director and senior research analyst at Wolf Research. He asked a two-part question, but we'll just focus on one part. He asked Chuck Magro, what do you say to people who say, oh my gosh, shouldn't seeds and traits and chemistry go together? Isn't that the gold standard of how an agriculture company is supposed to work? Here's what Magro said.
Well, look, fair point. Certainly there are benefits to having an integrated model, especially when it comes to seed and CP. But we all know that no structure or business model is perfect and there's always trade-offs, right? The two areas where we've invested the most time in, and I'd say resourcing for our integrated model is really on technology. You said R&D today and commercially. So if you think about technology, it's pretty interesting, right? Because the perfect example we can give you is Enlist. And by every dimension, it's been a success. It's $2 billion of revenue. But that was created, if I can take you back, that was created by two companies, Dow and another company, right? So, it's been a while since we've had invention inside of one company to do technology integration the way it's been done. In fact, we think that there are more opportunities because the market and the way resistance issues are just escalating exponentially around the world. We're going to need to have more collaborations and partnership, more than we've ever had before. And these systems are going to become what I called open source or multi-modes of action. And let me just take you to the next generation for Corteva, right? So the next generation for soybeans is HT4. We haven't named it officially yet. And it is the combination of Corteva and others' technology. And that will launch in the early 2030s. So think about that for a minute. We've already made and decided on the next technology platform that will take us out 15 years. And that is a system that, because of resistance issues, is multi-company and multi-mode of action. So when I look at this, I don't see any downside around, in fact, I see more upside around having more collaborations in the industry on technology, as long as the science is sound. So then if you fast forward and you think through the commercial integration, this is an area where I would say for Corteva, we've been at this for 6 years. And so we've got a lot of experience on what works and what doesn't. And I'd say today we're basically at an inflection point where most of our markets are still separate commercially. Especially our large markets, for example, in the U.S. We don't have a lot of overlap in our sales force. And if you look at the Pioneer agency model, it's actually a pretty small percentage that actually sell CP. And there's reasons for that, right? If you think about CP and seed, just put everything on the table, these are fundamentally different businesses. They have different technologies. Their channels to market are very different. CP primarily goes through the retail distribution channel, and seed goes through multi-channels, but primarily direct, and then look at their supply chains, right? CP is a global supply chain where scale and size matters. And in seed, they're regional supply chains because we're talking about biology. So when we put it all together, and we've studied this very rigorously, the board has went through a fulsome process here. When we look ahead to the future and what both of these companies need to do to be successful, we feel that there are more benefits for having two publicly traded companies than having an integrated model.
So that explanation from Chuck seems to make sense. Globally, when you're talking about crop protection products, you need to have big volumes, you need to have big savings, and margins are probably going to be pretty tight. But then when it comes to seeds, your production and your supply chain is going to be as close to the grower as you can possibly get it. The next question came from Vincent Andrews from Morgan Stanley, and he asked about the ambitious timeline of Corteva. Corteva says they want to make the spinoff happen in 2026. So depending on how you look at it, that's either a year away or a little bit less than a year away, depending on how you look at the fiscal year. Corteva CFO David Johnson had answers to that.
We are starting the Form 10 process right now, so we will give you an update as to when that's actually going to be, probably in the early part of 2026. Probably the one reason why we have an accelerated timeline is just all the work that has been done previously. So when you look at typical spins, some of the longer lead time items would be things like legal entity separation, system separation, and so on. Over the last 3+ years, we've invested in a new system primarily for the CP business. So the CP business, other than biologicals, is all on one ERP, brand new system. And at the point in time when we implemented that system, we also had to split the legal entities. So a lot of those things that would typically take a long time in the separation have primarily been done. And as Chuck said, some of our channels and commercial teams are somewhat separate already today.
Now, the next question was a tough one. It came from Goldman Sachs, specifically Duffy Fisher from Goldman Sachs. And he asked a tough question to Chuck. Hey, with all the competition in the crop protection world, and in a world where crop protection is increasingly being run by Chinese companies, how in the heck do you expect to compete? How will you ever be a top 3 company in crop protection with all this consolidation and with all this pressure from the Chinese?
Yep. So, look, difficult to say on whether we'll see another wave of consolidation. And I will just be explicit. It's not really the primary driver of our separation. But if you look at the global crop protection industry, there's been a lot of shifts over the last 5 years, right? The market is well supplied. You referenced it. We have low cost producers now in China, and it's a competitive market. Nothing I'm saying should be a surprise to you. When we fast forward, okay, so what do we think is necessary and needed to be successful? We're going to need global reach and scale. We're going to need very low cost, so cost competitive will be even more important in the future. But the market still values differentiation. And that is an important, statement I'd like to make. But partnerships and collaborations, I think, will become mission critical. And why do I say that? I don't think, because of the regulatory timelines and the expense to bring new actives into the market now, not all CP companies can be all things to all customers. They're going to have to make capital decisions and make bigger bets because it's so expensive to bring new technology into the market. And so can consolidation help with that? Yeah, I think it can. So to your question about our business, when I look at the last 5 years, what has our business done? Our CP business has increased margins by almost 200 basis points. And how have they done it, right? They've taken out significant costs and they've really moved towards more differentiation. And I think if you compare that to others in our industry who probably has sizable margin compression. So I think the business, its formula that it has today is a success. And going forward, if we give that business a very good balance sheet and its ability to generate solid free cash flow, I think it will determine its own future when it comes to how it wants to participate in the market. But I'll say that it'll have a lot of strategic opportunity.
And we have time for one more question from the conference call that we cherry picked out. Have you ever had a conversation with somebody about the present and the future, and they want to bring up the past? Well, that's what one analyst did on the call with Chuck Magro. You know, Chuck used to lead Agrium. And the analyst asked, Chuck, back in the Agrium days, you believed in having retail and wholesale together. What's with the change of attitude, Chuck? Chuck addressed it head on.
Look, you're going way back in history, and I guess I would just say, I think going forward, when I look at the markets, the future of agriculture is going to get more high technology. I do believe that when I think through where I think both CP needs to go to be successful and where the seed business needs to go successful, they are clearly on different paths. When you think about what CP is dealing with right now and where that will go, you're going to need to be very low cost, super efficient, world scale production with these global supply chains, and that can innovate and partner to get the product into market. The patent lives are getting less and less, so you have to go big very quickly. All of this leads me down the path of that this business is going to just have more optionality separate. Whereas with seed, I think where we're going to take it is it's going to be a crop genetics company that we're going to use the science in terms of gene editing, biotechnology to really take this to the next level of seed design. And so those paths are just distinct and different. And then when I look inside of the corporate structure that we've built, as I've said, we're running two essentially separate businesses today, and it's a bit cumbersome and it has some efficiencies. And the only way to unlock that efficiency is to separate them. Your reference back, I'll just take you back to where you referenced, what we're talking about is almost a decade ago, right? And agriculture and the agricultural markets have evolved substantially from that period of time. So much so to the point where, yes, I do believe differently than I did a decade ago.
That was a great answer by Chuck. Don't you wish every time somebody asks you about something you did in the past or some opinion you had in the past, you could give that kind of an answer just like Chuck did? That is all the time we have for the Farm Show this week. By the way, you can hear that entire conference call by going to the Corteva website and clicking on Investors. We will see you next week right here on Westplex Talk 104.5 at 10 a.m. Saturday on the Farm Show.